Good afternoon and good morning to those in a different time zone, and welcome to the SEEP webinar entitled Many Mansions, Our Material Future in the Post-Pandemic Era. And I want to thank our host, Joe Swimmer of SEEP, and I want to thank our great panelists, and I would like to invite you to pray with me. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Loving God, be present with us this afternoon as we take counsel for the future of your church. Give us a sense of hope and dedication as we go through this period of new beginnings. All this I ask through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. So this conversation grew out of a need to have a conversation about what comes after the pandemic. And SEEP has been very eager to have a conversation which focuses on how church leaders can come to terms with a new reality that's being born with us today, but not in a negative way, in a positive way. A reality that is driven by an innovation, imagination, and positioning our parishes as healthy spiritual centers for the future. But it's also a conversation about practical matters: space usage, cooperation with other institutions, hybrid worship, Zoom welcome, and above all, sharing our faith and building a beloved community in this new era, which is inevitably going to start. I'm Bill Franklin. I'm the assisting bishop of the Diocese of Long Island, and in 2019, I retired as the Bishop of Western New York, which means Buffalo and Niagara Falls and the western part of New York State. I would like to now introduce our five panelists. First, Bill Jarvis of Bank of America, who is a parishioner at Christ Church in Greenwich, Connecticut. Simon Mainwaring, who's rector of All Saints Church in Atlanta, Georgia. Jeff Thornberg, rector of the Church of Our Savior in San Bernardino, California. Julia Whitworth, rector of Trinity Church, Indianapolis, Indiana, and Marek Zabriski, rector of Christ Church, Greenwich, Connecticut. Bishop Ian Douglas of Connecticut wrote a few years ago the following words: "Once upon a time, the Episcopal Church was a safe and secure institution in its identity and in its place. We occupy a special place of social, political, religious privilege. And yet the number of Episcopalians has declined from a high of 3,650,000 baptized members in 1965. I would like to add that the shock of the current pandemic has the potential to accelerate this decline, but it also has the potential to give us great opportunities. And this afternoon, our panelists are going to talk about opportunities for positive structural change and programmatic change that allow the Episcopal Church to embrace and speak to a post-pandemic culture which is being born. Speak in a way that is appropriate to these times. So I can think of nothing better than a conversation like this afternoon at the end of August. The Episcopal Church has faced crises before. In the 18th century, we were on the wrong side of the American Revolution. We represented the English Church. And after the War of Independence, we had to make vast structural changes to move our church from working with a monarchy to being a church of a republic and a democracy. And I believe that those changes vastly improved the Episcopal Church and made us and laid the foundation of the great church we are today. So we should not fear cycles of boom and bust. And we've had cycles of boom and bust. As the Bishop of New York, for example, I'll say more about this later, I inherited a diocese that had lost 40% of its members. But we came to see the future of the diocese as something which we ought to work with a neighboring diocese to have one bishop for two dioceses. And that led to a structural change, which I believe has blessed my old diocese during this pandemic era. I had no idea this was coming, but I knew we needed a structural change. So today we are talking about these opportunities. So I would like now to call on each of the panelists to speak about how they are analyzing the situation right now and how they're responding to the pandemic in both proactive ways. Who is a parishioner of Christ Church in Greenwich, Connecticut, and who is a director of the Bank of America. Bill Jarvis is coming to us by phone today. So over to you, Bill. And unfortunately, people are not going to be able to see you, but they can certainly hear you.
Well, thank you very much, Bishop
I hope
Franklin, and thanks. Yeah, thank you very much, Bishop Franklin, and thanks to all of you for joining me. Can you hear me all right? All right, hearing no response, I will proceed. Introducing myself.
Yes,
hello. All right, good.
You're breaking
Bill
up
Jarvis,
a little bit, but.
All right. Bill Jarvis, I'm a layperson and lifelong Episcopalian. I've been a member of churches in both large and small communities around this country and indeed outside the United States. Places as diverse as Rochester, New York, where I grew up, New Haven, Connecticut, where I went to school, also Chicago, New York, Brooklyn, and now Greenwich, Connecticut, but not accepting an assignment abroad in Tokyo, Japan. In every place that we've lived, my family and I have been involved as volunteers, choristers, commission members, teachers, vestry members, and indeed a warden in various capacities. And for the last 2 decades, I've been lucky to be a member of Christ Church in Greenwich, where Marek is our rector, Marek Zabriski. Coming to my comments, for the last 15 years, I've worked as an expert on investment policy and governance for endowed nonprofit organizations like the membership here. 12 of those years were with the Common Fund as executive director of their in-house think tank, the Common Fund Institute. And for the last 3 years, as Bishop Franklin said, I've been with Bank of America based in New York City. So in this context, my expertise extends to the issue of what we would call business models across various types of nonprofits, including religious organizations. And it's in that context that Joe Swimmer and our colleagues asked me to speak today. I've reviewed the entire nonprofit sector, educational institutions, healthcare organizations, social service and cultural organizations, in addition to religious organizations. And the trends that we are seeing manifest themselves in different ways, but place similar stresses on individual organizations. So turning to the situation we're in now, as Bishop Franklin said, the pandemic is serving as an accelerator of already existing trends in the economy and in society generally. And the Episcopal Church is, of course, not exempt from this phenomenon. As Bill Franklin mentioned, membership and attendance, frankly, at all types of mainstream religious organizations, including the Episcopal Church, have been in what's sometimes been called secular decline for decades, particularly in the Northeast where we live, where church-going as a social custom has dwindled, though not in all sections of the country. Here as well, the built legacy of the Episcopal Church, not only churches, but facilities, other types of outreach, schools, as it currently exists, this built legacy is very extensive and pervades almost every community. But the fact is that that built legacy may be substantially in excess of current and likely future needs. And the financial and human resources needed to sustain that built legacy may outweigh those resources that are likely to be available. If we turn to the shock of the pandemic, the forcing of the temporary closing of churches, the radical restructuring of observance and mission fulfillment worship has accelerated these decades-long trends. It has also had the effect, the pandemic, common across the nonprofit sector, of increasing expenses for churches and nonprofits, while at the same time decreasing, in many cases, revenues, placing significant stress on operating budgets. I should also say that the movement for racial and social justice is not unconnected with these exigencies of the pandemic, and this movement will also play a role as an accelerator of already existing trends and intersect with some of the things that we've already mentioned. It's furthermore unlikely, as Bishop Franklin mentioned, that even when a safe, effective, and widely distributed vaccine has been made available, the trends that we're outlining will be completely reversed. If this set of circumstances is accepted by you, we would then propose that it's incumbent upon church leaders to consider what the future church should look like, how it should be structured, and where the resources to support it will come from. And that's the role of the expert panel that we have today. So to sum up, the church's business model, in quotes, if you will, has long been under stress. And the current pandemic, as an accelerator of already existing trends, offers both threat and potential promise or opportunity. So with that as background, I'm going to hand it back to Bishop Franklin to continue the discussion.
Thank you very much, Bill Jarvis. And now I'm going to call on our 4 rectors in alphabetical order, if that's okay, starting with Simon Mainwaring of Atlanta.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Bill Jarvis, for setting up the conversation there to help us think about these big questions. And the story I want to tell from All Saints Atlanta is one of identity and mission, big questions, because we're in the midst at the beginning of the pandemic. We were right at our sort of stage 2 of a parish-wide discernment process for what we might do with our block. And that's because in just the last few years, the church had purchased the last remaining parcels of land on the block. And so for the first time, we own an entire city block. And what we've found is this pretty seismic question in our church's recent history has sort of faced the pandemic and what I'd like to describe as a twin reality that has been laid bare. One is the changing significance of the church in society. And even here in the Southeast, where people still see it as part of their civic duty or their sense of belonging or their sense of religious loyalty to be part of a church community. We're seeing an emergence of the church and the desire for people to be part of communities that can bridge divides, that can cultivate deep and meaning-making relationships, and a thirst for communities that are fluent in spiritual seeking and holding on to ultimate questions. So the pandemic has laid bare some of the ways by which this change for the church has to move through, pertinent to Bill's points, some of the changing resources that are available to us to be leaders of communities, material resources and otherwise. The other thing that's been laid bare have been society's pre-existing conditions. And here in Atlanta, we have the sort of, if you like, the promissory note, the voice that's set into the future of Dr. King. And so we are constantly asking ourselves, how does this city speak of our place in the kingdom and our response? And so we're seeing that the pandemic has both, in fact, how we're having a conversation today, the many connection points between people in a digital age, as well as a profound sense of dislocation that people have from one another. The sense of loneliness for many people, and the ideological polarities that, of course, that are coming into full view in an election cycle, but also other pre-existing conditions. Atlanta has been for several years the most financially, in terms of wealth, inequitable city in America. The pre-existing conditions that have been manifest in people's healthcare outcomes, education and employment opportunities, structural racial inequity. So I think that the pandemic has shown us they're not just two Americas, urban, rural, red, blue, black, white, but multiple and largely separately layered Americas. And so there's this sort of splintered society that we have to find a way to articulate our mission in. So that's somewhat abstract view, but these are the sort of philosophical questions that we've felt press upon our mission. And so we've at All Saints have had to ask ourselves, what is most essential for us in being the church in society? And what is most essentially the need that we see in society that we as the church should turn toward. And so for us, this question of what we do with our block in a booming part of town with an incredible renaissance, particularly with technology companies and people moving in to live in our part of town, we discerned that we needed to pause that discernment process, not only because of how dispersed we are and economic uncertainty, but we felt that the murder of George Floyd particularly, those events opened up a way for churches like ours to ask ourselves what our part should be in the life of the city. One of our taglines is "in the city, for the city." So if we're a church in and for the city, what should our work be in joining that effort toward racial equity and healing? And so it raises questions for us about, as we imagine our future structurally in terms of our property, what are we willing to sacrifice for the sake of the community around us? How can we use our city block? How can we leverage what we have for the needs that this pandemic has revealed more clearly, both in terms of a increasingly post-religious society, but also this post-pandemic society where we have woken up along different levels. So that's been the sort of, that's the part that we've found ourselves at and continue to watch and learn.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to ask Jeff Thornberg now of San Bernardino to talk about what his analysis and response is. So over to Jeff.
Thank you, Bishop, and thank you for all of the presenters. I'm in San Gabriel, California, which is just south of Pasadena. To give a little bit of history of this area, this is a very wealthy neighborhood of Los Angeles. Historically, the Church of Our Savior has a model, a very philanthropic model. What I mean by that is we have satellite entities. We have transitional houses for people in recovery. We have another after-school program in a much more disadvantaged neighborhood. And so in the 90s, this church was set up to kind of raise funds and resources that then to spell out to our other satellites. And within the last 20 years, there's been significant conflict in this parish, while this neighborhood has turned from a basically Caucasian neighborhood to an almost universally Asian neighborhood and recent immigrants. And as that change happened, because of the conflict in this church, adaptation happened in ways that were comfortable for the most part to leadership. Meaning, if you start a service in Mandarin Chinese, instead of taking a piece of the pie, you ask people to find more pie and take a piece out of that new pie. And so within this pandemic, as we withdraw resources from ongoing ministries, I've been challenging my vestry and my staff, and as well as leaders in all my ministries, to be very courageous in asset mapping. And incredibly courageous about asking hard questions around vitality. I became acquainted with a phrase, I believe, from the Bishop of Missouri around requiem or renaissance. Requiem or renaissance. And asking my ministries, which is it? Requiem or renaissance? And are we willing to ask the hard questions in order to be set up for success in a proactive way, not in a reactive way? How are we going to be honest and honest with the pie that we have and allocate in a just and equitable way given the changing circumstances? One last story. I'm a hockey player, and so I forgive my sports analogy, but Wayne Gretzky always said that the effective way to play hockey is to figure out where the puck will be and end up there. So I'm asking my leadership, where's the puck going to be?
Right.
Where are we going to be, and how can we have the courage to have the best asset allocation in that circumstance? Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And now I turn to Julia Whitworth of Trinity, Indianapolis.
Thank you, Bishop. Thank you, Bill, for putting this together, and Joe, of course. It's good to be with you all and hear about our different contexts and ways of thinking about the church right now and our churches right now. I feel like to talk about right sizing and any of the work that we're doing at Trinity Indy, I have to give a little bit of context, like others before me. I came to Trinity here in the Midtown area of Indianapolis 4 years ago. And to understand Trinity, it is a resource and relatively affluent parish in a not affluent neighborhood. So the bulk of my parishioners commute from other neighborhoods. We do have some who live nearby. It's a neighborhood that's gentrifying, but this is a city like many that wealth and poverty live in very close proximity, and it changes on a dime. By worshiping numbers, we're probably would be considered program sized, but the scale of our campus ministries, things located right here, were undoubtedly sort of corporate in our operations, and I would say in our impact on our neighborhood. And for the most part, that's because of decisions that were made long before I got here, really wonderful, courageous decisions to acquire property and then use it to serve the community, particularly from resources made possible by a significant benefaction in the 1970s from Eli Lilly. So from that, Trinity's campus is home to 6 other not-for-profits. We're about a half-acre size campus, and we have 2 schools, a K through 8 or pre-K through 8 Episcopal school, a daycare center which serves a mixed socioeconomic families 50-50 on SNAP assistance and who are full paying. We're home to a food pantry, a legal aid clinic, a home for teen mothers, and a Horizons program, which addresses learning loss for children living in poverty. And these are all partner organizations, many of which were incubated by parishioners and seeded by the church. And we have another partner organization that we're in the process of incubating, which is a home for LGBTQ youth right down the street. So pre-pandemic, we were actually probably in a waning phase of the boom bust trends Bishop Franklin put out. I mean, we've actually been growing for the last 4 years. We were seeing a full nursery, a full church. We were preparing to add a worship service. I was calling an additional clergy person to my staff to have a curate. We're starting conversations about a capital campaign to build a new parish building because we don't all fit in our parish hall, which is a great problem to have. We have an empty house on campus, and we were starting discernment around starting an Episcopal Service Corps house possibly for that. And our parish giving has been up consistently for the last 6 years. And after the first 4 years at Trinity, I'd done a lot of moving around of staff and sort of felt like we were poised now for phase 2. And now we're in a pandemic and things are changing. And to think about how to right size, I wanted to operate with a spirit of abundance, a spirit not only of the abundance which is we're graced to have here at Trinity, but also abundance in faith that our call to the future is one of possibility, no matter what might be happening around us. But also to be smart, to be quite blunt about it. So in terms of right sizing, I've been thinking about right sizing in 5 areas. I'm not going to go through all of them right now, but space, personnel, finances, program, and partnership, because I think those are really the sort of 5 central areas that I'm constantly trying to balance in managing this place. So I'll just talk about space for a moment. Like all of us, we had to quickly make these sort of actual virtual space set of decisions. So what is accomplishable in virtual space? And in our diocese, we were completely remanded to home for all worship. So we weren't allowed to film in our churches even. We were sheltering in place. And although I chafed at that restriction in March, April, and May, it became a really great opportunity to completely think about what you can do online and the nature of being with people in virtual space, as opposed to having people at home look at your real space. And so I really have embraced the creativity that came of that period for my whole staff. Even now, we're in a kind of hybrid form, like a lot of people. So We have two really lovely gardens, so we've come back into worshiping outdoors. And so we are doing 5 small outdoor garden services as well as a full online service that is created completely for online worshipers. And really being intentional about actual and virtual space and the possibilities for those has been a big part of our work in the last set of months. And I think will continue to be in the pandemic and possibly beyond. An opportunity of virtual worship, and maybe some of you all have experienced that too, is that we've actually seen a lot of newcomers. We've seen newcomers that have arrived who are tuning in from other places, but actually newcomers in our community that were kind of sort of curious, but probably too daunted to ever walk in the doors. And it's been really interesting to see some folks who have joined us online now show up in person faster than some of the folks who've been longtime Trinity parishioners. And so trying to figure out how to do newcomer incorporation in this moment where most of our church isn't back is complicated but interesting, and kind of life-giving in some ways. And a challenge to us, and I would say to all of us in the Episcopal Church, to use this moment to think a lot about how we tell our story of who we are in a really deep and real way that's not about a beautiful building or even about great music, because we can't really have our singers together in any way, shape, or form, but what we're called to do and be and how we talk about our gospel commission in this moment. I'll say one more thing just about space and this indoor-outdoor dichotomy. Well, for worship, we all went home. A lot of our outreach ministries and our outreach partners continued to be operational, but had to shift. And so being creative about what can be done outdoors has been a big part of our work in the last 5 months. So our food pantry sees about 150 clients Monday, Wednesday, Friday in a parking lot. Our Sunday dinner is seeing about 80 guests in the same parking lot, but a different part of the parking lot on Sundays. Our schools are now using all of our outdoor space as much as possible. So they're kind of tents everywhere. And children walking 6 feet apart to get to places where they can sit and be in fresh air. And I'll be honest, we've put conversations about building a new building on hold. Obviously, I should say, we did not call a curate. We've tried to just really be agile and concise. I could talk about personnel shifts later if there's time, and say, what do we have now that allows us to really live into our call with exactly what we have in this moment? And it's been hard, but really exciting. So I'll pause there and look forward to talking further.
Thank you. These have all been great. And I think one of the fine things about this panel is that we're spread West Coast, East Coast, South, and Midwest. And so we'll come back to the East Coast with Marek Zabriski to talk about Christ Church in Greenwich. So over to you, Marek.
Hey, Bill, it's great to see you.
Great to see you.
One of the last times we saw each other was in Italy. So it's
Right.
good to see your smiling face, friend. And I hope to see you in person.
Not during the pandemic.
Yeah. I'm at the tail end of a month-long vacation, so I'm in a bit of never land, trying to recall all that we're doing and what's important. But it's a privilege to be part of this discussion, and good to see you all. We're working on something called Vision 2020, which is just kind of helping to focus our attention moving forward in a 5-year plan, and that includes helping us to be as worship-centered as possible. We've got a lot of members who are on the far perimeter of the church in these kind of concentric rings that just go out. And some of them are with us at best once or twice a year. These are people that often tend to be incredibly successful and talented. Being Greenwich, some of them are incredibly wealthy. We are really shooting ourselves in the foot by not involving them and bringing them closer to the center. So we want to be as porous at the edges and deep in the center as possible. We have 8 choirs. We believe that's more than any other Episcopal Church music program in the country. It's a major part of our ministry. We want to continue to develop that to a world-class level. We want to create a profound sense of community for all ages. Greenwich is composed of 60,000 people, ranging from huge mansions to 3 housing projects. And we have areas called the backcountry, which are 15 or 20 minutes from the center of town. And you could be extremely lonely in a house back there on a large property, or you could be lonely in a condominium complex right behind the church. And we want to help build community for everyone in the area of Greenwich and beyond. Building a strong community within the church has not been as much a strength as it could have been in the past. Christ Church is a place where you might have walked in 10 years ago and the ushers wouldn't really greet you with a smile, and you'd feel like you walked into a club that you weren't really invited to be part of. We're looking to increase the diversity in our congregation, both in terms of people of color and the LGBTQ plus community. We've just started a LGBT plus group and had our first gathering before the pandemic hit, and that really was a great success. Greenwich is predominantly white. It's 11% Hispanic, 3.6% African American, and we just don't represent that in terms of our parish as a whole. So we want to become a much more colorful congregation and diverse congregation. We want to become a high impact church that is just making a major difference in a lot of people's lives. And we want to surround people with profound pastoral care. We want to be a powerhouse for children, youth, and young families, and are really focusing on those areas of ministry. And lastly, we were trying to leverage our preschool that has 105 children to become a closer partner and a really visible entryway into the life of our church. Our latest clergy hire is not only the director of children's and family ministries, but she's also the chaplain to the preschool, and we've never had that role before. One of our biggest challenges is that our stewardship has been level for 25 years. Our endowment has been level for 35 years in terms of the strongest markets in history. I was really kind of shocked to learn about that. I assumed Greenwich was just a home to so many people that work in hedge funds and private equity and the financial industry, has just not managed its endowment effectively and has borrowed from it heavily over the decades, which is a practice we've absolutely ended. And we're going to just watch that grow and then be looking to do a capital campaign to add to that and handle some things on our property and to really put the church on really strong footing moving forward. To do this, though, we've had to, we want to succeed. We're a strong church. We want to become even stronger. We had great momentum prior to the pandemic. Our goal is not to let the pandemic weaken us, not even to come out of it just as strong. We want to come out stronger, more agile, and as a more creative church. Let me first speak a little bit about stewardship, because if churches don't get this right, they shrivel, downsize, and decrease in their capacity for ministry with every year. So we've absolutely got to get this right. Our greatest asset is our membership. We have 1,600 members. Our chief job is to help each of them get connected and deepen our sense of community and put them on the strongest spiritual learning curve possible. 3 years ago, our stewardship was 1.2 million in what is probably the wealthiest zip code in the United States. Christ Church was clearly underachieving, and so we've had to focus on turning that around. In the last 3 years, each year we've gone up by 200,000. This year we raised 1.8. In addition, we raised another 200,000 in a pandemic pledge campaign in addition to receiving a PPP loan. It's absolutely vital for us to do that because we've lost all of our rental income, which is about 135,000 right now, and 4/5 of our plate revenue seems to be just down. That's another 100,000. So this year we aspire to go to 2 million in annual giving, if not more. And that's just to break even on what we've lost. But every year moving forward, we want to go up by 200,000 to become a much more stronger, high impact church. And when I arrived, we were only giving $37,000 away through outreach. We want to get to $250,000 as fast as possible. We rented out to a church that was a competing church in our community using space on our property. It sent a terrible signal to our parish that we couldn't pay our own bills. So we've ended that relationship. They're doing just fine on their own, but we didn't want to look like we've got to have outside folks renting our church in order just to pay our electric bills. The biggest things to turn this around are we had to paint a clear vision for the future, share key financial areas of stress and need, be clear about what was needed, find out who has significant resources and invite them to be part of transforming something wonderful and make a high impact, and tell the story of impact over and over again. And part of that is getting everyone on a strong spiritual journey. We started the 2020 Bible Challenge using materials I developed in 2011 through the Bible Challenge. We've had over 400 people sign up. Some dropped off. We still have 375 people doing it. That gets everyone grounded in Scripture and doing something every day. Spiritual. And everywhere I've done that, I've seen stewardship go up strongly. People get very engaged. They share their faith. More people join. It's just, you can't lose with it. We started bringing in outstanding speakers on Sunday morning. We had a great speaker series, but that only focused on 5 or 6 people a year. And those were on Saturday nights, which I feared was probably the worst possible time in our community to have a guest speaker. So we focused on having them on Sunday morning. Yale Divinity School is 45 minutes away. We've brought great scholars down from there. And on September 20th, we have Archbishop Rowan Williams doing a virtual lecture for us on his book, Being Disciples. We've sent copies of this book. It's only 87 pages long to every single pledging household in our parish. You can do that for like $2,000. It's a great investment in your stewardship and in your discipleship and your spiritual formation. It's a way of thanking those folks who've been so generous and committed to our parish. And so we're going to have 3 virtual discussions of the book prior to his lecture on discipleship. And it's really helping folks who are pulled in many directions to focus. This is the center of our life together, being disciples for Christ. We're also stepping very strongly forward to address racism. We haven't done a big job of this in the past. We've created an anti-racism and healing task force. We plan on engaging a consultant and are looking at several different folks right now. We've got 60 members of our community involved in this. We've created 9 separate subcommittees. Our goal is to get all 1,600 of our members and more engaged in this process. And we're looking at it as a minimum of a 10-year commitment. This is going to take decades to make changes in, but we want to have a long, sustained, faithful direction of doing this. We're seeking a priest of color to join our staff right now, looking to diversify our staff in every single hire we make. We'll be doing book studies, movie series, discussion groups, speakers, broadening the diversity of the kind of speakers that are coming on Sunday morning. And we want to focus on listening and learning. And after a significant period of time of doing that, move towards action. So those are just a few things we're looking at right now.
Hey, great. All right. These are all 4 inspiring stories of what great parishes are doing right now. And we'll come back. A few questions have come in from the chat, but I wanted to say a word about a diocesan project that I was involved in. And I think this is why Bill Jarvis wanted me to be a part of this. So I have mentioned before that I was elected Bishop of Western New York in 2010. The diocese in the decade before had lost 40% of its membership for 2 reasons. One was globalization. South Buffalo alone lost 40,000 jobs because of the closing of steel mills and auto factories. We had churches down there that had 300 people on Sunday drop to 30. But I was dedicated to everybody working very hard to grow. And we did all sorts of things. We had programs in which one rector could serve 2 or 3 congregations without merging them. All sorts of adaptive reuse projects. Some worked, some didn't work. But we couldn't push that lever beyond this level. We just couldn't move it really forward. We were sustaining ourselves. Next door to us is the Diocese of Northwestern Pennsylvania. Sean Rowe, a young, very active bishop. They were the same Rust Belt culture that the Diocese of Western New York was. And so beginning in 2013, Sean and I started saying, well, why can't we start working together? Maybe we're so similar. We could do joint projects. We had a joint board of examining chaplains, joint deacons formation, joint conventions, joint clergy. You get the picture. And in 2017, I realized, oh my God, I got to retire in 2 years. What are we going to do? And this was what I thought. Even then, I thought, what if there's another crisis like the crisis of globalization? Will this diocese be able to survive? And so Sean and I and both dioceses started talking about the fact that once I retired, the diocese could consider Western New York electing Sean as provisional bishop. And between September 2017 and November 2018, we had a discernment process of both dioceses equally, in which the bishops stayed out of it, led by the standing committees. Sean, of course, who would in this plan be elected provisional bishop, talked about what he might do. And it was many, many months of a process led by the two standing committees, getting everybody involved and saying, could we do this? Have one bishop for two dioceses that would not merge, would still be independent dioceses, but would have one bishop for both, one staff for both. And you could think of how much can be saved by something like that, that could be put into missional strategies to allow us to move beyond that 40% decline, to move forward. And I thought also, what if there's a crisis? Having no idea that actually there would be a crisis. Lo and behold, the pandemic happened. And of course, I'm not in the diocese now. I really don't know the nuts and bolts of what's happening, but I think the diocese has done well in this situation of having a seasoned young bishop, of having two dioceses working together with all the talents that would bring together, and really allowing an opportunity for new, even more new structures to be built because of the pandemic. So I think if I began, you guys may know that I'm a historian, so I love thinking about the 18th century. And if I think about that story, it inspires me to think about our time, that we can be like those leaders, that we can be thinking about new ways. And we've listed so many ways, and you've given us all sorts of examples. I think the past can give us hope. And I am a man of hope, and I gather you are people of hope. So let's take a moment to answer some of the questions that have come in. I'll just tell you of some that have come in, and you might start talking about those. And then I would like for you to ask one another questions. The first question that came in, someone wanted Juliet to repeat her 5 goals. They were so struck by that, they wanted to make sure they had all 5.
Sure. And these, I will say, these weren't part of a strategic plan. This was just what has been both a result and my intention in terms of right sizing during this COVID crisis. But I spoke about space, but then also right sizing personnel, finances, program, and partnerships. And if you want, I can just say a word
Yes,
about the
should.
other 4 space I think we've covered. Personnel, I will say, I am so blessed because we were not in a situation where we had to furlough any staff. We were able to keep even our hourly workers paid all the way through the summer. Some of that was because we also applied for a PPP loan, and that allowed us to do that with more ease. And some of it was because I took the opportunities that arose with some natural transitions just to shrink down our staff. So a parish receptionist was leaving because in fact she's the spouse of a priest and he got a new call. We didn't replace her because we don't have people in the building that much. So there's not as great a need for that. And our scheduling works differently. We generally have an associate organist. This was a year of transition. They're usually graduate students. We're pausing on that until the new year because we're not worshiping with a choir in the church. And in fact, we're revoicing our organ right now. So we don't even really have a functional organ. Looking for opportunities not to get rid of people, but also be more agile. Our parish life person isn't planning a lot of big events right now, so she stepped up to do more reception work and et cetera. So we've been able to just really trim down staff to save money, but also it's allowed us to have money to help our partners in different ways. So if we are feeling comfortable with our resources, we can be more life-giving to the not-for-profits with which we're in partnership that are providing life-giving services right now and in deep need of assistance. And so it really allowed us to, I think, care more outward as opposed to inward as a congregation. Then on finances, we're really blessed. Our pledging has remained strong. This was a church that had done a lot of work to get people online before this. Thank goodness. So online giving has been fine, but like Marek, plate giving has shrunk quite a bit. And because we also rely on investments, we've been watching the market with great care and trying to make smart choices about when and how we draw on invested resources and position ourselves to do less of it and time it better. And then program, I'll say a word about this because I think this is no matter your scale of your church. I am trying to be really attentive to right-sizing program right now because burnout is real. And everyone I know, clergy, laity, is going into the program year completely tapped out. I see Jeff nodding his head. He has small kids. I have kids in school. A lot of my most active parishioners, I'm seeing they're just tapped out. So trying to really discern what will be nourishing and life-giving for the parishioners and not just us doing program because it's the program we've always done, and letting go lightly of that which is less essential and holding on tightly to that which is deeper, sort of like Marek was talking about. We've been engaged in anti-racism work as a parish for 4 years at least in pretty vital ways, but trying to figure out how to move that from study groups to advocacy and sort of boots on the ground action has been really important because people are sort of tired of book studies in our parish right now, or at least they're tired of Zoom. So, and use this opportunity to build program that I've been wanting to do anyway. So more small group, more intentional connection. And then partnership, one of our resources is partnership. So learning from the people that know better than we do. Our school had incredible resources around the pandemic when trying to engage reopening. So I put myself in those rooms to learn from the director of Homeland Security, who happens to be a parent at the school here in Indiana, I should say. And giving what we can give and learning what we can learn. So we're not using our parish nursery right now. We've given it to the school to use as their COVID containment room because we can. So just trying to operate in this sort of, Jeff talked about asset mapping, like what are the assets that we have that we can share, and then what are the assets in our neighborhood and in our partners that we can use with great care so we come out stronger as in our community.
I think that's what you're saying here really leads to the next question people have been raising, because I think Julia has said you're blessed with people and resources, even though they're challenges, as Marek has said at the moment, but all of you are blessed in terms of numbers and money. We just have to be frank about that. What do you want to say to those clergy and lay leaders who are on this webinar who are not as filled with people and money? What would you say, particularly addressing your question of how do we move into the fall when people are tapped out and Zoomed out, and yet we're going to still have Zoom, no doubt. So what advice do you all give to colleagues who are in smaller?
I know I just spoke, but I just want to, I would love to reframe it. I don't really want to be the big wealthy churches giving advice to small churches. Like, I think we need to be looking to be partners and say, what can we learn from our partner churches that are doing this hard work, in similar and very different contexts. But I would like to be talking about partnerships right now across dioceses, you know, and the churches that say have a larger staff can figure out a way to work with churches that have a smaller staff without being seen or threatening to in any way supersede or harm. I would love to see Steve talk about that, how we can help the whole church.
Great. Anybody else want to jump in on this? How can the broad spectrum of parishes, from your point of view, respond to tapped out, zoomed out?
Bill, I'll just say on the size of the congregations, I don't think matters as much. I went hiking on Monday with a rector of a smaller church in our community, and I've been a priest significantly longer than he has been, and I had plenty to learn from him, and it was wonderful to hear about what his congregation is doing. We can learn from them; they can learn from us. I think the principles, you know, if you want to make an impact, if you want to build your stewardship, if you want to transform people with spiritual formation, they work whether your congregation is 100 people or, you know, 3,000 people. So I think people shouldn't get bogged down on size too much. In terms of the zoomed out, I do think we have to be careful with how much attention what we put before people. And so when we make an offering, you know, what I'm saying to our folks is if we're going to offer it, we want to make sure there's a certain number of people that are going to be likely to participate in that. Any of my staff can do something with a small group of folks. But for instance, on Sunday morning, I have a metric of how many people I'd like to see attend a forum, whether it's in person or virtual, to make it worth bringing that person in. So if we're going to focus and say, hey, we want your attention, we want to make it worth your while. And I think that's a good success thing when people could get zoomed out heavily if you do too much little stuff.
I think this is a new word, to be zoomed out. It's sort of odd to be saying this as we're zooming at this very minute, but I think we all know what we're talking about, right? Everybody watching, and we all know what that's like. Jeff and Simon, what do you have to jump in and say about this topic where we're on right now? Either one or both.
Yeah, I was going to add that, you know, I do think economy of scale matters. I know in my church, because of what's happened the past decade, it feels more like 12 small churches than one big church. And so one of the things I've tried to engage each area of ministry is to I've been challenging each ministry to ask what they've done in this time that has been effective as far as engaging. And then ask what the components of that, very basic appreciative inquiry. Asking, so Zoom's not working, did you do something else, or did you do something in that setting that did work? What were the components of that worked, and how do we duplicate or translate that into a different context? I think can help adjust for that economy of scale difference. That's what I would add. Okay,
that's great. Simon.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. I would just say that the thing that transcends any scale is what to take that notion of zooming out. What are we zooming into in terms of the society we're living in today? And I think that the church has done best when it has been mostly concerned about the world it lives in and least concerned about the institution of the church. And so I think the thing that has been stripped away during this pandemic is, if you like, is the sort of the extra, the superfluous. And that for me, part of the Zoom fatigue is on a spectrum. And then the other end of that spectrum would be the real pain and loss, including loss of life, that people are seeing every day. And so I would say that regardless of the scale, there's an opportunity for us to say something of consequence to the world around us. And no matter how many people are part of the village that constitutes the church, that has remained and will remain the vocation of the church, to offer something, to proclaim something of the gospel in a fractured world. And I love what Jeff raised up, and I'm going to credit you and use it again. I love that question, requiem or renaissance? And it begs the question for me, for who might we be reborn? And if we're thinking about growth, where should we grow? And to my own answer to that question is that it's clear and present that we should be seeking to grow out in society. So for us, beyond our block,
Right.
Be the church in that way.
Right. And then it leads to another question I want to ask. Marek, I was glad Marek mentioned the Bible as a resource. That's always good on a church conversation. But what are you discovering as you go through this as a powerful, or rediscovering a powerful spiritual resource that has been almost uncovered, a treasure that's been uncovered during this pandemic time that you think might give power and a way to address being tapped out and zoomed out? Anybody want to share a bit? What's been the spiritual dimension of this period for you and for your people?
Bill, one of the things we're seeing here in Greenwich, where a lot of people commute into New York City and have never had dinner with their children for ages, they're all having family dinners every night, and they love it. And I think that's going to change this community. I think more and more people are going to find a way to work remotely or take, several days in the office, but several days working from home. And that sense of family dinners, having time for quiet. I mean, it's turned a lot of us into monks. We've had time for silence and solitude and reading and prayer and working in the garden and taking walks, connecting with nature. So from a spiritual point of view, I think it's had a strong uptick for a lot of folks. And that foot constantly on the accelerator has had to back off. So it's been good.
Anybody else want to say something about this, the rediscovered good, the new insight?
I have no great insight, but I'll say the Psalms have been really powerful for me in this season in a way that I don't think they have been before. Just the breadth of human experience that they capture. And I think since we're living in a time where we move from grief to confidence to fear to hope, just aligning ourselves with people in struggle in the past in relationship with God has been really powerful.
And some people are tweeting. Go ahead, Marek.
Someone posted about the daily office, Bill, and we've had a small group doing that. We've struggled over the years to try to get folks to come to church and do the daily office in the chancel. But now that we do it virtually, we've developed a group that's very faithful about doing that. And it's been a joy to connect at 8 o'clock with folks every day, Monday through Friday. And it's built a real sense of community and a community that prays for one another.
I see a lot of people nodding. This has certainly been true of me because I've been able to join in the Cathedral of Long Island on Garden City in the mornings, and there are about 40 people who are part of that Zoom morning prayer, which is really is a wonderful blessing. And I think a lot of people, as you've mentioned in your conversation, new people are coming in to the church, I think, so it's part of Zoom welcome. I think that's something, if we had another day. Jeff wants to speak.
Yeah, no, I would add, I've had a few opportunities as a result of the negative effects of Zoom. And what I mean by that is our church does not have a history of being connected to our neighborhood. It's a pretty anti-religious neighborhood. And as a result, almost all professionals. And I find there's been dozens of times now that I've been out in front of my house with a headache with my daughters. And I've gotten to know my neighborhood now because there are other young professionals in the same circumstance. And so that's been a tremendous opportunity, actually.
Well, I took a week off from Zoom and hiked 38 miles through Manhattan, mostly in Harlem, which I hate to admit, I really had never walked the streets of Harlem. And it was because of Zoom. I mean, I thought I got to get out of here and see people and see the city. So there are blessings out there. One question, and then I think we'll move towards some final comments. Any of you might, some final words want to share. Several people, I'll merge these together, said, we've been talking about spiritual growth and spiritual programs. At what point do you think you would sell property to support ministry and spiritual growth? Or as a way, another question came in, are we too burdened by our properties? And do we need to be liberated from properties? Do you want to say a word about that? How you balance property and spirituality and ministry?
I would first look to utilize the property before selling it. And I always think it's a horrific thing to sell things rather than to strengthen stewardship and take a shortcut, because that's a shortcut that you're taking everyone on for decades. And, our church has been around 271 years. So if you sold some large chunk of property 250 years ago for the next 2.5 centuries, people haven't been able to benefit from what kind of ministry could have been done on that. So we have, we've got 100,000 square feet of buildings in 10 acres. It's a lot to oversee, but we try to maximize the use of all of it. And I would rather err on the side of trying to be creative and find ways to use that as a benefit. I know, Simon, you folks have been doing a great job down in Atlanta with envisioning what you want to do. And I love what Trinity Wall Street did when they built their new building. They had charrettes with people from around the community to see how would you like to see this space used, versus just doing that within the church, but letting people from beyond the church say, well, could we hold concerts here, or, have a yoga class, or you name it, and let it be seen more as something, a collective resource to the wider community.
Okay. Let me, in the last minutes, just ask each of you if you might like to make a closing comment. Something you suddenly has dawned on me you wish you had said earlier in the conversation. Now is the chance to say it. Or just a final word, which you would like to leave with the people who've joined us through this webinar.
This is Bill Jarvis, and maybe I can just start while people gather their thoughts. This has been so very rich and so grounded in our spiritual truth. I think it's very moving for me as a layperson, and so I thank you all. One of the threads that runs through, if you will, the nonprofit sector at moments like this is the question of, as I mentioned earlier, higher expenses and lower revenues. And this leads to questions relating to resource sharing, sharing of staff, pooling of staff. It leads to questions about consolidation. It leads to questions which kind of hover over our last question about the burden of buildings, questions of closure, something that the English Church has had to deal with now for the last 50 years. None of these are eternal. They're issues that are going to come to each parish, each diocese in its own way. But one of the things that I think is encouraging about this conversation is that we have within the church examples of actions that have been taken, of resources that have been creatively used to begin to address some of these problems. So I look at this conversation, and I hope that our colleagues at CEEP will agree with us on this, as a beginning or a planting of a seed of resources that can be helpful to parishes, regardless of how well-resourced or what kind of assets they actually have.
Okay. Thank you, Bill Jarvis. Let's just go around. Julia.
I think one of the stories Episcopalians like to tell themselves is that we're so bound in tradition that we can't change. And I think leaders get really afraid of big, bold changes. And we think it's going to take at least 5 to 10 years to shift a culture. And if there's a blessing of the last 5.5 months, it's actually learning that Episcopal churches can pivot pretty quickly and be really agile. And even our elders can find their way in a digital age if we hold their hands and help them. I find that really exciting. I know that at the point at which a vaccine is available, distributed, God willing, equitably, and life is restored, our churches won't be the same. And I hope one of the ways is that we'll be actually bolder and braver about change in the future, now that we know we can.
That's great. Jeff?
Yeah, I want to reiterate what Julia just said. I think any of us in the right context, over the amount of time, in the right people around us, have a list of things that we think should have been changed for decades, generations, maybe. Let's not lose opportunities. That's what I would say.
My senior warden said, never waste a crisis, right at the beginning of this.
That's another good motto from this.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of good one-liners from the conversation today. I hope it's been recorded so others can use it. Simon.
Yeah, I think that the removal of a building as a common gathering place has heightened the need to how we pay attention to each other, how we are attentive to one another's lives, both within a church community, but also within the context where that church finds itself. And I think that's been in many ways the preeminent question for the Episcopal Church. Are we paying attention to society around us, to the changes around us, and including the people that we find in our communities, in our church communities? Are we paying attention to how they are seeking, but also finding and have already found the grace of God in their lives? And so I'm hoping that it will lead us into a more authentic and faithful, a sort of stewardship of the hearts of people. That this may, be a great, again, a sort of renaissance for the post-pandemic church.
That's right. That's right. Marek?
Bill, I'd just say cultivate your garden. I'm looking out the window here, and I've created a pandemic garden at the rectory. I've got a really beautiful piece of property behind the house, and I was sitting out there doing morning prayer and reading the Bible each day, and then doing some other reading, and it was all green and lush and beautiful, but I just missed color. And so I think about that. I can't wait to open up a year from, this coming spring and next summer, hopefully to have lots of receptions over here at the rectory for members of our congregation to enjoy the garden and the space. We've created a landscape committee at the church, and we've just got some funding for that that's come in. I think that will grow and mushroom, because I think people deeply need beauty, and they deeply need to connect with nature and be outside. And I think this whole colorful element, our society needs that. We're a more beautiful society as we are more colorful. Some people have pointed out that the White House garden was so colorful, it's just been redone. It's made all white. I think that takes away from things. And lastly, I just say that cultivate the garden of our own soul. If I have found prior to going on vacation that you could work to the end of the day and there were no boundaries. So I think living that kind of Benedictine model where you have more order to your day and you set margins on it is vital for all of us moving through this pandemic, and to cultivate our own soul so that we are going deep and coming out of great depths to speak to and care for people and help them move forward as a spiritual community.
Well, I think that is a very good conclusion. Thank you so much. You guys have been authentic and realistic, but what I valued most, you've showed great confidence that though our church is small, it's a great church, and greater things are yet to come with leaders like you. So thank you so much. Hope we can gather again one of these days and actually meet one another. So God bless you all. God bless everybody who's joined this conversation and into the future.
Blessings, colleagues.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.